Hello, Jamaica Plain. It's very lovely to be here. All that heady praise, I might fall over. Lots of things to start saying. Thank you, Chuck, and all of you for inviting me here. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you, Joni, for a lovely introduction. Joni and I actually only just met about an hour ago. We've been working together on this book for, 2-3 years, and we've just met in person, and it's lovely to meet her because she's given me such wise and generous and insightful advice in editing over the years, so thank you, Joni. It's been a real pleasure working with Chelsea Green. So, lots of things to say. I hope everyone's got one of these little flyers, and I know what you're already thinking. You're thinking, why has this been printed on 2 pieces of paper? She's here to talk about the environment. She used 2 pieces of paper. I'll tell you what happened. The guys in the photocopy shop were going to do it double-sided for me, and when I went to pick it up, whoops, they've used 2 pieces of paper, and they said, don't worry, we'll bin the whole thing, we recycle, and we'll print them all for you again. And I said, no, please, don't do that. So you get a special edition that's got magic extra pages where you can write your own notes on Doughnut economics. I hope you'll add your own ideas, maybe your own diagrams. You've got to turn an accident into an advantage. So there we are. You can add your own diagrams into Doughnut economics. So let me start with a little quiz, a little question here. Who here has ever studied any economics? Put your hand up. Oh my goodness, they're out in force. Okay, and who's never studied any economics? Okay, and who can't believe that they're at a talk about economics? Right. And then economics, which one do you say? Who says economics? Oh, is it just me? Oh, who says economics? Oh, it's just me. Okay, it's an English thing. I use both. It's a big debate, isn't it? Okay, so I'm just going to kick off and say a little bit. Joni gave me an introduction, but I think it's always important to know who is this person suddenly standing up in front of us? Where have they come from? What shaped the way they think? So I'll just tell you a little bit about where I come from before we dive into the reason why I left my job to write this book, to write the book that I wish I could have read when I was a student at university. So, I studied economics at university 25 years ago, and I was really frustrated and disappointed by what I learned because I wanted to change the world, wouldn't you? And yet the issues that I cared most about, like social justice and environmental integrity, were just pushed to the sides. There was some sort of marginal concern. And so I was really frustrated by that. And so when I left university, after 4 years of study, I was way too embarrassed to call myself an economist. I mean, who wants to be that, right? That's why I now feel okay, I can say I'm a renegade economist, and then I feel sort of socially acceptable. But I just refuse to call myself an economist. Oh, I forgot to say, Mary and I are doing a special double act here. We have no clicker, so here we go. Let's see if this works. Woo, it works. So I went and worked 3 years in the villages of Zanzibar, working with barefoot entrepreneurs who had nothing to rely on but their wits, the community, and the forest around them. Then I spent 4 years on a very different island, working in Manhattan, being one of the co-authors of UN's Human Development Report, thinking about the really big picture of human development in the world. Then I joined Oxfam, and I worked there for a decade, and I loved it, working on the campaigning front line, from workers' rights in global supply chains to climate change. And while I was there, I drew a picture that looked strangely like a donut. I'm going to tell you more about that, obviously, which I realized had a lot more power than I had already drawn on it. And it inspired me to take the risk of a lifetime, and I left my job in order to write this book. And at the same time, I was asked to teach at Oxford University at the Environmental Change Institute. So I have 1 foot inside academia and 1 foot outside, which is a very nice way to be, by the way. So that's the story of my career. And every career story is really just a series of bad haircuts. But it's also a story about your values and what you realize matters in the world. And I thought I'd walked away from economics. But of course, at the end of all this, and after having children, I should add, I have twins, 8-year-old twins, I realized that you can't walk away from economics because it frames the world we live in. It's the mother tongue of public policy. And if you want to shape the world, we need to take economics by the horns. So I decided to walk back towards it and flip it on its head and start with the values and principles that I think matter in the world, and then ask myself, what kind of economics would give us even half a chance of achieving these? And that's what this book, Doughnut Economics, that's the story it sets out to tell. So I just mentioned a story. Let me tell you the story of the donut, or rather what it is. Let's see how This man's inspiration is huge for me. Bucky Fuller, I'm sure you know him. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So I thought I'd take Bucky on at his word and not just critique what I'd learned, because the days for critique are long past. The best form of protest is to propose something, is to construct something new. So I decided to construct something new. And I sat down and I tried to draw a picture of what I thought progress for humanity would look like in the 21st century. And it sounds ridiculous, but it looked like a donut. So you all have this donut in your hands. Let me tell you what's going on here. In the hole in the middle of the donut, it's a place where people are falling short on life's essentials, be it food, housing, healthcare, education, political voice, income, access to electricity. All of these are actually the 12 dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals that have been agreed at the United Nations. These are agreed internationally, are the basic minimum standards for humanity to be able to lead lives of dignity, of opportunity, and community. So we want to get everybody in the world out of that hole in the middle, over what I've called a social foundation, so we can all lead good lives. But, and this is a very 21st century, but we must make sure we don't go beyond that donut's outer crust, because beyond there we are overshooting our pressure on the planet. We are pushing the fundamental Earth system processes that this planet has, that's given us the incredible stable home of a stable climate, of ample biodiversity and fresh water, of a protective ozone layer. And we are putting pressure on these systems to the point that we are at high risk of kicking our planet out of the stability we've known for the last 11,000 years. So, it's a big challenge. How do we get everybody out of that space of shortfall in the middle while staying within the planetary boundaries that enable our planet to allow us to thrive? Because of course they're interdependent. Our health and our well-being is dependent on that planetary health and well-being. So if that's some sort of compass for the 21st century, we want to reach the safe and just space for all in the donut space in between social and planetary boundaries. The real question, of course, is where are we now? Where are we now? And on the back, this clicker is great. Mary, you're a great human clicker. And on the back is the picture. It's not news to anybody, but it's pretty shocking when you see it in one image. Many millions of people around the world fall short on life's essentials. 11% of people don't have enough food to eat, and even that may be worse at the moment. We know they're on the brink of famine in countries from South Sudan to Yemen. 1 person in 4 lives on less than $3 a day. 25% of people in the world don't have any access to electricity. All of these shortfalls, and they're happening in countries rich and poor, of course. Many millions of people cannot meet their most basic needs, and yet we have already overshot at least 4 planetary boundaries on climate change, on nitrogen and phosphorus loading. That's technical language. What that really means is excessive use of fertilizer, which runs off, doesn't go into the crops, it runs off through the fields and goes into the water and turns the water green and kills off the sea life there. Excessive conversion of land for human use, and also massive biodiversity loss. And maybe even on air pollution and chemical pollution. The scientists haven't managed to quantify those, so we don't know where we are on them, even though we know they're important. So this is the state of humanity. It's striking. It's not an easy picture to look at, because we know that we've taken ourselves to a pretty tricky place. I think it's an indictment of the path of international development that we've followed for the last centuries, because we've already pushed beyond our limits of pressure on the planet, while many millions of people still can't meet their most essential needs. If we could begin to turn this story around, actually begin to come back within those planetary boundaries while getting everybody in the world out of severe deprivation, that would be the achievement of a generation. I mean, that would be the most extraordinary legacy to leave to our children and all of their grandchildren. Because at the moment, we're on track for being remembered as the era of reckless overshoot. And if we don't want to be remembered like that, if we want to be remembered for the era of turnaround, we've got a lot of work to do. And I believe one of the places where that work starts is with rethinking and rewriting economics. So that's what's brought me back to the roots that I walked away from. So I think we need a new story of a future that we actually want to create. But we shouldn't forget something, because everyone says we need a new story, we need a new narrative. I agree. But the most powerful stories are so often the ones told with pictures. From your childhood favorites, to the stories of creation, to the stories we tell ourselves of how the modern world works. Pictures are powerful, not just because they're memorable, because you probably all know all of those pictures I just showed you. Not just because they're memorable, but because they're paradigm changing. Copernicus knew that. In the 1500s, he spent his life looking at the motion of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy here, with his picture with Earth unmoving at the center of the universe, he knew Ptolemy had it all wrong. But Copernicus waited till he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his own picture. Because by putting the sun, not Earth, at the center of the known universe, he was threatening church authority, he was upending papal power, and he was questioning man's place in the universe. It's extraordinary what havoc a few concentric circles can unleash. So we should ask ourselves, what are the pictures that we learn when we study economics? All of you, like me, who studied economics, all of our children, our nieces, nephews, who are off to university to study Econ 101, because isn't it good to know a little bit about economics? What are the pictures that are being put in their heads? And are these pictures actually helping them? And these pictures actually make me angry, because the students of today are going to be the policymakers of 2050. They are the people who are going to shape the direction of human society through this century. Whether they become members of the Senate, or journalists, or lawyers, or doctors, or business leaders, or community activists, whatever role we play in life, we carry a picture of the economy. So they're going to be the policymakers of 2050, but they're being taught out of the textbooks of 1950, and those are based on the theories of 1850. And given the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to extreme inequality to repeated financial crisis, this is shaping up to be a disaster. Because these diagrams, people say economics is taught in equations, and it's often taught in equations almost to bore you out, or bore out those who are political. But economics actually isn't equations. I think it's in the diagrams, because these diagrams linger in our minds like intellectual graffiti long after the equations have faded. Did you know that more than half of the nerves in your brain are linked to your visual capacity, and they link up to the visual cortex at the back of our brain? So these pictures sit for years, even when we don't know that they're there anymore, but they are there, and they're shaping what we see and what we don't see. So they matter, because I believe these pictures silently answer some key questions in economics that we never actually discuss in the course. Questions like, what is the economy? What is it for? How does it work? And who are we? And I'm going to give you a speedy tour of these 4 questions tonight. And we could ask for no better guide than this gentleman. He worked just across the river. I don't know which way the river is, but he worked just across the river in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is Paul Samuelson. He was a professor at MIT in the 1940s, and he was the brightest economist around. People say he was the greatest economist of the 20th century. And in the 40s, Samuelson was doing some really esoteric theory, and his boss called him in. He said, Paul, we've got a problem. All the engineering students who were coming to MIT had to study a little bit of economics, because that was a good thing to know, right? And his boss said, you know, they hate it, Paul, they hate the economics. Can you help us? Can you come away from your esoteric theory? Write an economics textbook for them. Whatever you include is good economics. You can leave out what you like. Yours will be good economics. So Samuelson couldn't resist this. And he realized, actually, when he wrote this book, the power that lay in writing the textbook. Because his textbook, called Economics, first published in 1948, went on to be the biggest selling textbook across all subjects, across all university campus in the US for decades. And Samuelson realized the power, as he said, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write its economics textbooks. My favorite bit is what he said next. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. So watch out because Paul Samuelson thinks your mind is a blank slate, and he wants to lick it. And of course, he has already licked it, whether or not you've studied economics, because the diagrams that he drew are still the ones that shape how we think about the economy today. So when Samuelson sat down in the 1940s to draw a picture of the economy, the whole household, he drew it for his engineering students. Why not? He drew it like a radiator. He made it look like a radiator system. The water is money. So the water comes in at the top and it flows around between business and public. By public, he means what we would today call households. So it goes around, the business pays wages to the households, and they spend their wages as consumption. Money goes round and round, just like water in a tank, right? Well, that diagram has changed a bit, but only a little bit over the years. So here is what you would meet today. It's called the circular flow diagram, and it's the biggest picture of the economy that a professor of economics can show you, right? And this is the little game you can play with. You say to them, show me the biggest picture of the economy you've got. This will be it. So we've got households and business, just like Samuelson drew, the money going round and round. And there's some leakages. Money goes off into banks and comes back as investment. That actually turned out not to be true, and that drawing of it is one of the reasons why we had a financial crash, but that's another story. Some money goes off into government and it comes back as government spending. Some money goes off for imports, but it comes back, don't worry, from trade, from exports. So it was a useful diagram for looking at how money flows and income flows, and it's useful if you want to measure GDP or measure the size of national income, because this is how they do it. But it makes absolutely no mention of the living world. No mention of all the resources and the material and the energy that's drawn in from the planet every day and spewed out as pollution. It makes absolutely no mention of the unpaid caring work of parents, and let's admit it, mostly women. All the cooking, washing, cleaning, scrubbing, raising the kids and folding the ironing and making the dishes and starting all over again tomorrow. All that work that creates labor, fresh and ready, at the factory door every day. No mention. And it makes absolutely no mention of the commons, that space where people get together and organize themselves, not with the market, not with the state, but just for themselves. I would say Jamaica Plain Forum is pretty much a good example of the commons. People getting together and creating something that they value. No mention. Well, if you're going to miss those things out, you're missing out the living planet on which we depend. You're missing out the household where we begin every day. You're missing out the commons, which is actually one of the most dynamic places in the economy today. And those silences in Samuelson's diagrams have come back to bite us. So he got to define in the 1940s what the economy is, and this apparently is still what students learn today of what the economy is. What about who we are? Well, it was Adam Smith who first wrote the portrait of humanity that's now at the heart of economics. And he drew a nuanced portrait because Smith recognized, he's been deeply discredited, this man, poor guy. He recognized that self-interest is a powerful trait for making markets work, but that our interest in others is essential for making society work, and these things need to be worked together. So Smith recognized both of those, but when future economists came after him, like John Stuart Mill and William Stanley Jevons, they wanted to create a simplified model. That nuance got in the way of modeling. So John Stuart Mill said, we're just treating a man not as a whole, but political man, as an economic man, just as a creature who wants to accumulate wealth. So they picked out that trait of self-interest and said, this can be the DNA of our character. So this rational economic man that's grown up at the heart of economic theory and is still there today, he's never actually drawn in the textbooks. But if he were, he'd have to look something like that. He'd be a he, he'd be standing alone, money in his hand, ego in his heart, calculator in his head, and he'd have nature at his feet. And the trouble with his portrait is not just how absurdly narrow it is, but it's what it does to us. Because on being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. Research in the US and in Israel with students has found that the more that economic students learn about rational economic man, the more self-interested they become, and the less they value compassion, altruism, and interest in others. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. when we see this character and we're told he is a model of man, he actually becomes a model for man. We start to mirror him. So there's a huge responsibility on economists, but of course on scientists and academics in every discipline about how we tell ourselves who we are, because it changes who we become. What about how the economy works? Well, in the 1870s, a small group of economists were desperate to make economics a science as reputable as physics. And they were awed by the work of Isaac Newton and his discovery of the physical laws of motion. This is Newton's diagram of a falling object pulled to the ground by gravity. And so when William Stanley Jevons started drawing his economics diagrams, you can see how he intentionally made it look just like Newton's diagram. He drew it in the style of Newton's physics diagrams. And Jevons talked of the market mechanism, market forces, and equilibrium. And he wrote in his books, just as gravity pulls an object to rest, so prices pull a market into equilibrium. They use it as a very direct analogy, like the physical, the mechanical physics of the time was going to be the analogy for economics. Now, economists in the room, here's your little pop quiz. What do you think Jevons is deriving here? Well, let me ask it another way. What's the first diagram everybody learns in economics? Supply and demand. Let's see the next picture. Yes, that was the demand curve for the supply curve. This is still the first thing the economists are taught. How the market apparently is cleared. Prices bring the market into equilibrium. It comes from the 1870s and the desire to show that the economy apparently is like gravity. Well, if there's one thing we learned in the 2008 financial crash is that just gravity is not a very good way of describing the way that markets work. They work more like a flock of birds wheeling and circling in the sky and rising and falling unpredictably. So this has not been a very smart metaphor. But that's not the worst of it. The most pernicious thing that's come out of this desire to be like physics, and the wrong kind of physics, is that it set economists off on the desire to find economic laws of motion, just as Newton had discovered the physical ones. And there are two apparent economic laws of motion that economists thought they had discovered that I would say have shaped policy in this country and in my country and in many other countries for decades. Let's have a look at them. There we are. They look extraordinarily similar to each other. So the first one here is inequality going up and income per capita on the bottom. It's drawn by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. Kuznets collected data from the UK, Germany, and America on income inequality over time. And he said, I think I see a pattern. I think I see that over time, as countries get richer, inequality first increases and then it decreases. He was looking from about the 1870s to the 1950s. The first thing Kuznets said was, that's not what I expected, because I would expect the rich to get richer, not the poor to catch up. So this goes against some expectations. He tried to come up with some explanations for it, something about rural to urban migration, but he gave us caveats. In fact, in his original paper, he wrote, this is 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, and probably a lot of wishful thinking. It would be terrible if this became an unwarranted dogmatic generalization. Was anybody listening to that bit? No. That got swept aside, and this Kuznets curve that every student has learned tells us a mantra, unspoken, but we can hear it in our ears, that if you care about inequality, well, here's the message. It's got to get worse before it can get better, and growth will make it better. So don't come to me talking about redistribution. We need to grow this economy. Redistribution will only slow that process down. Now, if that sounds slightly familiar, that's because it's given ground to trickle-down economics and austerity economics, and it was apparently underpinned by Kuznets' curve. Well, the work of Thomas Piketty in 2014 came along, and Piketty went back and looked at the full set of data, not 5% data, more like 100% data. He said, you know what? Kuznets was looking at this at a really unusual time, post-war. War had wiped out a lot of the capital that the wealthy had accumulated, and governments came in with the New Deal, or in the UK, the creation of the National Health Service, and were doing a lot of redistributive spending. So he was actually capturing an unusually interventionist period in time when governments were redistributing. This was the active engagement of government. It wasn't a natural process. But that was only found out years, decades later. And the mantra has sunk in, and that's why it's still used to justify major bonuses for bankers. We have to endure the inequality because it makes us all better off in the end, apparently. Well, just as Kuznets's curve was beginning to be questioned and people were realizing that countries aren't always getting more equal. I mean, OECD countries, the world's richest countries today, are their most unequal in 30 years. That pattern isn't playing out. So that is not a law of motion. It's spurious. We have policy choices, and the level of inequality in a society is a policy choice, a matter of design, not enduring some sort of economic law of motion process. But just as that was being debunked, along came some other economists with a new diagram. We think we found an economic law of motion. Well, they didn't actually say that, but that's what they felt. This time about pollution. It looks so similar, the curve they drew. They just called it the environmental Kuznets curve because they said, we've got some data. It's only for local air and water data. But what we think we're seeing is that when it comes to pollution, first, a country's level of pollution goes up as the country gets richer, and then it goes down. And they came up with all sorts of explanations. Well, people start to care more about pollution once they're rich, or the country can afford better clean technologies, and so they clean it up. Again, they posited this with some caveats. It's only local data. Now we've got more data. When we look at the global scale of greenhouse gas emissions, when we look at a global material footprint of a country, this does not play out. In fact, in London, all across the news at the moment, is the extraordinary local air pollution, which means school kids can't play in the playground. So even on the metrics they were using, it doesn't play out. There is not a law of motion. These things do not need to go up and down, and by the way, they aren't coming down. This is spurious, but it's justified policies that have pursued growth. So we need to overthrow both the thinking of inequality and pollution, social justice, environmental integrity. Both of them, we've been told, environmental alarmists, you're getting in the way of growth, growth will clean it up. Of course, the wonderful thing that those misunderstandings did was give all power to the story of growth. Simon Kuznets again, poor guy, I haven't got it in for him. He just happened to be there at the birth of lots of big ideas and all his caveats got tucked aside. Kuznets was asked by US Congress in the 1930s to come up for the first time with an income measure of national income. And he did. And when he created it, he said, this could scarcely be used as a measure of a nation's welfare. Did we listen? No. Because Kuznets said, it doesn't include the unpaid care economy. It doesn't include the work of communities. And it doesn't have a measure of stocks. This is just a flow of how much income, the value of goods and services exchanged is improving or increasing. It doesn't measure what's happening to the stock, whether it's of natural capital or other, that it's been created out of. So this is no measure. Wasn't listened to because the irresistibility of having a single number by which you could judge what was happening in the economy from year to year and your economy against other countries, now we've got a horse race on. And so growth became the mantra, became the target, and it became, in fact, a panacea. You've got a budget deficit, just got to grow the economy. Trade deficit, grow the economy. Inequality, grow the economy. Inflation, grow the economy. It became a solution to all economic woes. To the point that, in the 1960s, W.W. Rostow wrote a book. Where is it now? I got myself an original copy because I'm so fond of this book. He wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto. You can smell the politics of the time. And in this book, he described the process that economies go through when they grow, and he described it just like an airplane ride. At the beginning, they're traditional economies where not very much is happening, and then they get the preconditions for takeoff, where you get the beginning of a banking system, and a certain nationalism is touched in the people where they come to believe that growth is important for something beyond itself, like national identity or a better life for the children. He wrote all this. And then you get takeoff itself, where growth becomes the normal condition, and the march of compound interest brings its blessings. And then it goes from growth, it goes through a phase of maturity all the way up to the final stage, which is the era of mass high consumption. Well, the trouble with this airplane ride that Rostow has sent off on is that unlike every other airplane, it can never be allowed to land. It just has to grow indefinitely into the sunset of mass consumerism. Now, Rostow was actually aware of this slight problem with the flight, and he even mentions it. And then the question beyond, where history offers us only fragments, what to do when the increase in real income itself loses its charm? He asked the question, but he didn't answer it. And the reason he didn't answer it is because it was 1960. And he was about to become a presidential advisor to John F. Kennedy, who was running for election on a ticket of promising 5% growth. So Rostow's job was to keep that plane flying, not to ask when and how it would ever land. So that is a whirlwind tour through the diagrams that I believe create the mindset at the heart of 20th century economics. And each one of them, as I tell you about them, sounds rather ridiculous. And I hope you hear the caveats that their creators layered in. I'm not trying to blame those economists. It's what's done in the name of their ideas when they get politicized and simplified. They might sound ridiculous, but the holes they leave, the silences, the gaps, and what they don't talk about make it very easy to pick them up and spin a very powerful political story that is not good for the future. And that's exactly what happened, because almost exactly 70 years ago, in April 1947, a small band of economists met in a little Swiss village called Mont Pelerin. This is Friedrich Hayek, that's Milton Friedman. Ooh, hissing. And they met in a little Swiss village called Mont Pelerin, and they met to write a new narrative about economics. They called it Neoliberalism. Now, their motivation was that they were struck and afraid of the rise of a totalitarian state that they saw in the Soviet Union, and they wanted to push back hard against that. Their thought was, if you give the state an inch, it will take a mile. In fact, it will swallow you up whole. So you can have no room for the state. But their push against state totalitarianism very quickly morphed into a push for market fundamentalism. And even though they wrote this story in the 1940s, it didn't get put on the stage for a long time. They created think tanks, they funded university chairs, they founded journals, they talked to very influential people, they got funded by business. But it was only in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came to power at the same time. Reagan was surrounded by members of the Mont Pelerin Society. Margaret Thatcher's first chancellor, like head of the finance, was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society. And so when they came to power, this story got put on the international stage, and we've been living by its script ever since. So it's the neoliberal story starring the market, which is efficient. So we should give it free rein. It stars finance, which is infallible. So trust in its ways. Trade, well, that's win-win, so you should just open your borders. And the state's incompetent, so don't let it meddle. Now, Friedman was a brilliant narrator because he was funny, and he'd say things like, if you put the state in charge of the Saharan desert, there would be a shortage of sand within a few years, right? He was funny. Doesn't mean he was right, but he was funny. And it's a lesson we need to learn from him, that you need to be good at storytelling and engage people if you want to influence the way they think. So those are the stars of the show. There are other features, other characters in the story who didn't really need to come on stage because they were sort of brushed to the margins, but, you know, let's meet them. The household, well, that's domestic, so we can leave it to the women. The commons are tragic. We've all heard of the tragedy of the commons. You can't let people just look after something themselves. It'll get used up and exhausted. It needs to be sold off. Society, well, as Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society, so we can ignore it. Earth, we were told, was inexhaustible. And our ingenious ways, we will always find more and we will substitute. You can take all you want. And power, we don't need to talk about power in economics. It's irrelevant. So we can just not mention that. I believe that this story has been so powerful. I hope it's familiar to you in all the wrong ways, that you've never heard the script of actors before, and yet it's so familiar because it's the narration that we've lived by for decades. And I believe this has taken us to the brink of collapse. This story, which has ignored the living world, undermined society, ignored the unpaid care economy, told us if you care about inequality, just wait for more growth. If you care about pollution, just got to grow the economy. It has led us to a place where many millions of people in the world and in every society can't meet their most basic needs, and yet we've already overshot our pressure on the planet. So it's time for a new story. Can we turn this thing around? I believe we can. And that's why I want to tell a new story. So that was the really depressing bit of where we've been, and now let's tell a new story. And of course, to do that, we need new pictures, because the most powerful stories are the ones with the pictures. So let me introduce you to what I think are the beginnings of a new story of economics for the 21st century, and I hope you'll help me add to this, critique it, let's build it, because this story is going to take a lot of people building it together. So let's start with purpose. what the economy is for. Let's put that back at the center of economics. I believe the economy is for enabling every person in the world to meet their most essential needs in life and to do so within the means of the planet. And as you'll see on the bottom of my little flyer, to me that's the question. If we're going to achieve this, if we're going to get into that space of the donut, what economic mindset is going to give us even half a chance of getting there? Let's go, let's see. First of all, this is the first diagram I would like every economics student to meet. Not supply and demand. That's way too small a picture. First picture of the household. So what have we got going on here? We've got the economy embedded in society, embedded in the living world, because the economy is a subsystem of these and dependent upon them, dependent upon society for its institutions, its trust, to enable us to exchange and produce goods together, but also deeply dependent upon the living world, because every day it draws in living materials and matter and spews out waste. And there already, just from drawing a new picture, we have the major question of ecological economics, which is how big can that through flow of material and energy be in the economy before it starts to kick the earth out of kilter, before it pushes too much pressure on our planetary systems. We've got energy running, this river of solar energy, this great blessing we get from the sun every day, running through the economy, and it's up to us to figure out how to harness that energy and be incredibly resourceful to capture the best of the sun, which is our daily income of energy flow. But then on the inside here, we've got the economy. I've divided it into 4 key sectors, because in the 20th century, the economy, we were told it was the market, and then there's the state. And 20th century economics ended up being some sort of ideological boxing match between, are you for the market and laissez-faire and free market capitalism, or are you for the state and you're a socialist or a communist, as if you had to choose between these extremes. And in that boxing match, we lost sight of 2 other key sectors. The household, where we all begin every day. The unpaid space, where we all raise each other, care for each other, care for our children, care for our elders. It's the place of compassion, of love, of care, of socialization, teaching each other the values and the moral norms that enable us to be members of society. If we ignore that, we're ignoring the work of half of the world's women. Think of all the women in Africa and Asia who carry water and food and firewood on their head and a baby on their back, all for no pay. And they're keeping their families alive every day. If you ignore that, you're ignoring what keeps people alive. But also the commons, this space that we were told was tragic. And actually, thanks to the work of economists like Elinor Ostrom, we can realize it can be triumphant, because actually people can be incredibly powerful when they self-organize. Incredibly effective at using resources well, whether it's the farmers in Nepal who share water between their paddy fields, or a community like this that creates a space where you come together and talk, or a community that has a neighborhood garden where we work together and look after that, or people who go online and add to Wikipedia and share their knowledge for free late at night. No one's paying them. We do these things because it feels good to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves and to feel like we belong to a community and get recognition for that contribution. So the market, the household, the state, and the commons, I think, are 4 essential forms of provisioning. And I know I wouldn't want to live in a society that lacked any one of them, because I think they all have valuable roles. But that means the state has an important role of making sure that all of them can thrive and flourish. As for finance, finance should be a means of enabling that real economic exchange between those sectors. It should be in service to the economy, in service to us, in service to life. And that raises a very big question of how finance needs to be redesigned to be in service, rather than us being in service to the financial system. So there would be my first new diagram, not Paul Samuelson's radiator, but this nested economy diagram, because I hope you can see that by just drawing a new picture, we start with completely different questions and completely different concerns. What about who we are? We're not rational economic man. And that's damaging us, because who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. We're not merely self-interested, we are socially reciprocating. We work together, we cooperate, and we punish each other when we don't respond. We are not isolated, we're deeply interdependent, whether it's through fashion or opinion or politics or the stock market. We respond to each other. And we're not dominant over nature, we're deeply embedded within the web of life. And these changes that are happening in the description of humanity are being created by neuroscientists, sociologists, political scientists, economists. There's a new portrait of humanity being painted in economics, which is really important, because I believe this is going to be the most important portrait to be commissioned this century. There's going to be more than 10 billion of us alive this century. And if we continue to imagine, justify, and conduct ourselves as rational economic man, we stand very little chance of thriving together. If we come to understand ourselves as social, adaptable humans, we give us a far greater chance of doing well. What about how the economy works? Forget copying Newton. It was the wrong kind of science. We need to move over to complexity thinking, because most of the interesting systems in life, whether it's your family relationships or the stock markets or a flock of birds flying in the sky or an ecosystem that you love, all of these things actually follow complex behavior. And if you never got that joke about why did the chicken cross the road, or is that just an English joke? I think you guys might tell it here too. Why did the chicken cross the road? Chicken crossed the road to teach you systems thinking. So I'm going to very quickly show you the core of systems thinking. Here's two feedback loops. And on this side, we've got a reinforcing feedback loop. And reinforcing feedback loops works like this. The more you have, the more you get. So the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And the more eggs you have, the more chickens you get. And the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And you see where that's going. So things that are dominated by a reinforcing feedback loop, they spiral up, 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 or they collapse down. The fewer chickens, fewer eggs, fewer chickens, fewer eggs. So things that spiral and explode or collapse and implode, those are driven by reinforcing feedbacks. And they don't actually last very long in the world because they explode or they crash. So actually most things that persist in the world are dominated by a balancing feedback loop, which means the more you have, the less you get. So the more chickens you have, the more try to cross the road, and the more try to cross the road, the fewer come back. So that balances that. Most interesting systems in life you can understand when you look at them through the lens of systems thinking. And it's the interaction of these balancing feedback loops that can explain the rise and fall of the stock market, the rise of the 1%, the collapse of an ecosystem, the balance in our bodies that we call health, how our bodies are full of balancing feedback loops, right? If I get cold, my body will start to shiver to warm me up. If I get hot, my body will sweat to cool me down. So our bodies are masterful and thriving. Anything that's going to thrive in life is going to be dominated by balancing feedback loops to bring it back into that balance. So, systems thinking is at the heart of a new way of understanding economics, and that's why a lot of people in the cutting edge of economics are talking about complexity or evolution. And this means we need a career change for economists. Stop being a Charlie Chaplin reaching for the levers of the economic machine because they ain't there. The economy isn't a machine. There is no equilibrium to pull it back into. Be more like Josephine Baker in her garden. Think of the economy as a garden because it's continually evolving and growing, dying, maturing, changing constantly. It's like an organism rather than a mechanism. And some people, if you're thinking, oh, she's talking about economy as a garden, that's very laissez-faire, you know, the economy is its own thing. People have said to me, oh, that sounds very laissez-faire to think of the economy as a garden. I say, if you think that sounds laissez-faire, you've never done a hard day's of work in the garden in your life. Because gardening is about digging and weeding and tying and grafting and cutting. It's interventionist. You're shaping it because we design a garden. And so the question becomes, how do we want to design this garden? And I think there are two key design principles that we need to put at the heart of 21st century economics. And they are to make our economic garden distributive and regenerative by design. So let me say a little bit about both of those. Distributive by design, I've shown it as a network, as this sort of iconic image of what distributive design looks like. An economy that's distributed by design would ensure that value created is distributed far more equitably amongst all of those who help to create it. So think of an employee-owned company where the profits generated are shared amongst all of those employees who helped do the work, rather than sent off to distant and fickle shareholders who may never step over the door of the business. Think of Creative Commons licensing, where ideas aren't copyrighted and patented, they're put in the commons so that they can be added to and improved and used again and again. Think of community energy systems where a community gets together, puts solar panels on their community buildings, they own the energy technology and they receive the revenue from the energy generated. All of these are examples, everyday examples of distributive design. They show that it's happening already. As for regenerative design, let me tell you about this diagram. Through the middle of this diagram is the degenerative, linear 20th century industry, where we take Earth's materials, we make them into stuff we want, use them for a while, and then throw it away. And that's the way so much of what we use is designed to be used as. And of course, by doing that, we are cutting against the living systems of the planet. We need to bend those arrows around so that we allow nature, as biological materials, to regenerate themselves, as nature does. And then on the other side, the technical materials, whether it's the metals and plastics in this microphone or the materials used to make this, any man-made materials, that we restore them, repair them, reuse them, and create a cycle of reuse just so that we can become part of Earth's cycles rather than cutting against them and running down the sources of life. So I believe that these two design principles are the most powerful design principles we can put at the heart of a 21st century economy if we want to thrive and meet the needs of all, so that tackling inequality within the means of the planet, tackling environmental degradation and creating a regenerative economy. What does that mean then for growth, that old pursuit, that old obsession of ours? This is the hardest one, and it would be so much easier for me to write a book that didn't have this chapter. You know, if I wanted to be much more politically and socially acceptable, let's just cut chapter 7, because this is the thorny question that you're not supposed to talk about. So let's talk about it. At the moment, we have economies that are financially, politically, and socially addicted to constant growth. And they've been created that way. As Rostow told us, growth becomes the normal condition. The culture, the politics, the banking system, the business system, everything is adjusted to make growth the normal condition. You have a plane that has to fly forever. How do you overcome that? Because if you stand back from the growth of the economy, where we say, well, growth is good, right? Stand back and look at nature, which has been experimenting for 3.8 billion years and is a pretty good thing to learn from. In nature, growth is a really healthy phase, from your children's feet to the Amazon forest. They grow, but then they mature and thrive. I mean, my kids are 8 years old, their feet are growing really fast, and it's very expensive. But I hope that one day they will stop growing, because otherwise they won't be able to sit around my kitchen table anymore. Things grow until they fit, until they mature and come to the size they should be. So in nature, that's the way things work. So it's extraordinary that in economics, and I don't know about those of you who studied economics, but in 4 years of my education, we never once asked, is growth always possible? Is it always necessary? What happens if it isn't always necessary? What could we do instead? We never asked those questions because we're locked in. We're financially addicted to growth because we have a financial system that is driven by maximizing the rate of return. That is the DNA of the financial question and the financial system we live by. We've got a political system that's locked into growth. This is a photograph of G20 leaders meeting. And this photograph that's taken when they meet every year, I call it the G20 family photo. And no leader wants to lose their place in that family photo. But if any one country said, well, we're not going to pursue a growth economy anymore, we're just going to thrive, well, they'd soon be elbowed out by the next emerging powerhouse. So we've got the mother of collective action problems here. How does one country stop growing when every other country is growing? They all have to keep growing to keep up with everybody else who's keeping growing if you want to keep your global market power and your global military power and your place in the family photo. And then shopping. We've had a century of consumerism thanks to the nephew of Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays, who realized that his uncle's therapy, psychotherapy, could be very craftily turned to convince us of retail therapy. That you can convince people that if you really want security and love and freedom, you should buy something more. And he mastered this art. He called it public relations. I'd like to bring him back and say, okay, well done. Now help us undo that. How do we undo that century of propaganda that we improve ourselves by buying something more? Because today, as a result of these, we have economies that need to grow, whether or not that makes us thrive. And what we need are economies that make us thrive whether or not they grow. And 20th century economists didn't even ask this question. They would have been fired for asking this question. Still probably would be fired by most governments, by the World Bank, by the IMF, by most mainstream businesses. But I hear more and more economists actually wanting to lean over and listen to this radical conversation because some economies just aren't growing. So what are we going to do? So I think we need to ditch that airplane metaphor. Come down from the heady skies. And I think we need a new metaphor. So my favorite idea is a kite surfer. And I've never been kite surfing. I wish I could, but I don't know if any of you have. The kite surfer is on a board going over the waves, And then they've got a kite in the sky that's catching the wind. And the way they maintain their balance is they've got a bar. And they pull this bar up and down to adjust between the waves and the wind. And that's exactly how I think the future of GDP should be. You can think of the waves and the wind as the planetary ceiling and the social foundation, or you can think of them as distributive and regenerative, the things that we actually truly are working with, the boundaries, the parameters. And then GDP becomes a response variable that sometimes goes up because it needs to go up, or sometimes goes down. So think of China. China is currently spending $360 billion investing in solar energy capacity by 2020. Fantastic. That's going to massively boost GDP while they install that capacity. But then, after that, they'll have free electricity coming because it's zero marginal cost of generating electricity of that. So then the energy won't be adding to GDP. So you'll see GDP go up as they invest, and then it does nothing for GDP. So again, GDP becomes a responsive variable against the things we actually want to pursue, regenerative and distributive design. Can we do that? So, I want to write a new story of economics, the 21st century story, which stars Earth because she's life-giving, so we should respect her boundaries. It stars society because it's foundational, and that's why we must nurture our connections. This story stars the household, which is core, so we must recognize its contribution. The market is powerful, but that's a reason to embed it wisely. The commons are creative, and so we must unleash their potential. And the state, well, it's essential. And that's why we must make it accountable. As for finance, it should be in service. So how can we make it serve society? Business is innovative. And that's why we must give it purpose beyond just pursuing profits or maximizing shareholder returns. Trade is double-edged, so we must make it fair. And power is pervasive. It's in every relationship. So we must check its abuse. And I believe with this new story, we can begin to put ourselves on track to create the kind of 21st century economy we actually want. Of course, it comes with these new pictures. And these are my first go at drawing the new pictures. We're going to have to draw them again and again, and I'd love to hear your ideas for how you might redraw them, or what you might add, or what you would change, because it's the challenge and the suggestion that keeps this evolution going. And so I begin my book, and I'm going to end with what I begin the book with, which is to say, I believe the most powerful tool in economics is not money, and it's not even algebra. It's a pencil. Because with a pencil, you can literally redraw the world. And if you like the idea of drawing and you're as visual as me, I hope you would be inspired by these animations that are on my website. I've had the privilege to work with some of the world's best stop-motion animators, bringing to life these 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. Each video is around 1 minute long. And so whether it's changing the goal, getting into the donut, or ditching Newtonian thinking for systems thinking, or creating a regenerative economy, that's the degenerative economy, that's not the good one. Rethinking who we are. I hope you go online, have a look at them, share them, send them to your friends, send them to your economics professor, use them in your classes, because I want to help spread new economic thinking this way. And I really look forward to a discussion with you now. Thank you very much.
I'm curious to know more about the household, how you bring I guess, the labor, the economics of the household into the economic picture. What does that mean?
Okay, great. Great question. So how do you bring the economics of the household into the big picture? People have tried to do this in lots of different ways. One way that people have tried to do is say, well, what we need to do is count up what parents do in the house and put a market value on that. So how much would this cost if you're paying somebody to do this? And then we can add that to GDP. And if you do, and you kind of follow, the typical mother around, and she's kind of plays janitor and then nursery maid and then dinner lady and then all these roles through the day, it comes to sort of hundreds, something like $80,000 extra that this woman would earn in a year. When it can add up to around 40% to GDP. So one method to do it is that, and when people do that, I think it's more like saying, we want you to recognize the value. No one's actually paying this mother anymore. It's just a calculation, a notional idea to show that it's worth a lot. And for that point of advocacy, it's valuable because it makes people realize, wow, this work is worth a lot. And there's an strange randomness about what goes inside and outside GDP. So like if I asked Joni to look after my kids and she looked after, and I looked after her kids, then, and we were paying each other because, I'll pay you $100 to look after my kids the day, that's $200 going into the economy. Whereas if we both stay home and look after our own children, it adds nothing to the economy. So it's a very strange relationship that it has. My position on it is not so much about we need to monetize it and then add it into GDP, but rather respect the importance of the household and redesign the space of work so that it respects it. So maternity leave and paternity leave, right? In countries like Sweden, you can get up to a year only if the mother takes up to 6 months and the father gets up to 6 months. It's equal. And companies need to allow their workers to go off and do that without being embarrassed. Some countries, men say, we're allowed paternity leave technically, legally, but it would really make it look like I'm not very dedicated to my job if I actually asked for it. So there's all sorts of social, cultural norms that need to change as well. So parental leave, paid parental leave, in relation to the workplace, but also in relation to the state. So the state's role, healthcare, it's so topical here right now. When the state doesn't provide decent healthcare for all, guess who picks up the pieces? It falls back on the household. It falls back on the parents who have to provide care because there's no care provision. So that care doesn't go away. The need for care doesn't go away. It just goes invisibly into the household and puts extraordinary stress on parents, on carers. So I think of it in terms of the importance of both the state and the business in the market respecting the value that the household creates, and therefore changing the design of the state's relationship and the market's relationship to the household. As one very influential, Alvin Toffler, who's a very influential lecturer, he used to go around and talk to very senior corporate executives in ties, and he'd say, how productive do you think your workforce would be if they hadn't been potty trained? And who did that potty training? And kind of an embarrassing thing to say, but to point out that this labor that's been created has been socialized through so much care that we have to respect those roles. But that's just my take on it, and other people have different views, and they think it should be paid, or do you have a state payment for a carer? If somebody's at home looking after somebody else, perhaps they should get a wage. So many different ways of arranging this. What I'm trying to point out, there is the respect for it, and then there are different solutions we can bring to that. And I just want to say, those of you making comments, it doesn't have to be a question, right? I know there's so many ideas. It can be a comment, it can be a suggestion, it can be a critique.
Sure, very good, yeah.
Sure, I'll project. Thank you for your talk. Really interesting. One thing I'm struggling with understanding is this we that's so central to your argument here, and how the role of historical injustice and bias and discrimination fits into really fragmenting this we. And so how do you think through those historical and social injustices in creating, coming to an actual cohesive we? Because we're seeing this with the economic policies that are being driven out as disdain for the poor, disdain for immigrants, and discrimination, things like that. So how does that fit?
Great question. So the we, it's very often people say, when you say we, who do you mean? I very intentionally say we, because when I'm saying we, I'm often showing that the whole donut, and that is a picture of the whole world of humanity. And I'll tell you why I say we. So the word economics comes from the ancient Greek, and it was created by a man called Xenophon, who was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he wrote a book called The Economist, and it was about how do you manage a household, and he meant literally an individual household and a state. How do you manage your slaves? Do you trust your wife to be in charge? And the kind of basic questions that worried an ancient Greek estate owner. And towards the end of his life, he looked up to the next level of the city-state and asked a question about how do you manage the city-state as a household? How do we trade with others? How should we gather city revenue? So he raised it a level. And then 2,000 years later in Scotland, Adam Smith raised it a level again and asked it about the nation-state. Why does one national household thrive while another seems to be stagnating. And so economics today is still at the level of Adam Smith. It's at the level of nations as households and looking and comparing one to another, which is why this growth and this competition between them is so strong. I think our responsibility is to raise it up, the obvious, inevitable next step, and talk about the economics of the planetary household. So when I say we, I'm talking about we humanity on this planet. That's the we I'm wanting to invoke, and very intentionally, because I think more than ever we desperately need to see that collective human we and enabling all of us to thrive. So when I show that social foundation, it's about deprivation among all human beings. Of course, there's variation in what people consider as an appropriate education or appropriate housing or appropriate income in different communities. And you can't standardize that. That would be totally inappropriate. But recognizing ourselves as a collective we, and then I think we actually begin to look at some of the historical injustices on a global scale and you can start asking the story behind how come so many millions of people still can't meet their most basic needs, and yet others have overshot pressure on the planet. And to me, the explanation comes from the extraordinary inequalities, whether it's of gender, of race, of location, of language, of ethnicity, of religion. There are so many power relations that have dominated those spaces that lead to such inequalities today. So, and of course they exist on many, many levels, right? You can have extraordinary inequalities within a neighborhood, within a city, within a country, and within the globe. And it's hard to hold them all in your head at the same time. So what I hope the Doughnut does as an image is prompt exactly those kinds of questions of what is it, what are the forces at play that have enabled us to come to this? And people have taken it and scaled it down to the level of a country, down to the level of a city, and started disaggregating it. I've got gender inequality there because it's the only one that the international community have formally recognized, which is problematic, really. I mean, we want to recognize others. It's also the only one for which there's globally available metrics, globally available data. But imagine that out from gender inequality to all kinds of inequality of difference that we care about. And then you can take it into a community and start disaggregating who doesn't have decent food, decent education, who doesn't have access to these, and start looking at the sources of inequalities behind those. I say all that, and yet your question stands, and it's an important one, and it's the kind of thing that I think I want to keep. How do we take that further? So I don't want to sort of reply to your question that I've answered it, right? It's one of the questions of our times, and so we must keep that door open and keep asking, how can we better incorporate this and better reflect this in these kinds of models? So thank you.
Right there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, very inspiring. And I'm thinking about the people who are trying to live out the 21st century approach and build institutions, whether it's in cooperatives or the transition town movement that started in the UK. Can you share a few cases that have inspired you for people that are taking this trunk into their lives and building institutions that are needed to support this?
Yes, thank you. So at very local levels, I can tell that there's probably lots of people. The guy who was doing the recording, he said, I work in a local radio station and I live in co-housing. And it's right, I'm sure there's lots of you here who are already in that space where you could look at this model and say, yes, actually the structures of my life are already fairly distributive. I work for an employee-owned company or a co-op, or I live in co-housing, and they're regenerative. I'm really conscious about the way I live and actually live within the cycles of the world to the extent I can. And I feel like what I'm doing is describing with the principles worlds that already exist. I hope it's giving a sort of more abstract conceptual frame to a reality that many people say, I'm living this, which is of course very inspiring. But let me see if this clicker works if I click. Oh, she's gone. Let's just see if, because I want to show you a couple of examples. Go forward, forward, forward. Go up, back. Okay, tomorrow, on the 8th of May, in Stockholm, in Sweden, there's going to be a workshop that I was contacted by these urban developers in Sweden who wrote to me and they said, we love your Doughnut because we're developing a new district of Stockholm. It's going to be a new suburb. There's a train station been built, and they're literally developing a new suburb. And they said, it gives us a blueprint for innovating and creating. How do we meet the needs of all the residents of this new suburb within the means of the planet? And they sent me this photograph of their map, and look, it's got a little picture of the Doughnut on the page. And they said, we're going to call it a Doughnut district. district. Oh, I think, what have I done? Yeah, it translates. But they said, we want to create the world's most livable city districts, and we're going to start here in Stockholm. So that's happening next week, and they're using this to ask these very questions. And then I was also contacted by a community in South Africa who said, we love this donut. It's a town called Kokstad. It's in the fastest growing town in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. They said, we took your donut frame and we've used it to re-envision the future of our town. And we invited in all the youth of the town, and they said, this social foundation, these 12 dimensions, the youth added one. They added fun, because they said it has to be fun transforming your economy, right? So I love it when people take this concept and make it their own and change it. It's even better when they change it, because they're really making it local to themselves and saying, what would it mean for us to do this? So that's communities that are doing it. I'm also contacted big companies that are doing it. From Patagonia have said, we're using this is shaping us. Even the Mars Corporation contacted me the other day, we've been using this. You know, I don't know if they go all the way with it, but the fact that there's some people in the company, because there are good people everywhere who are trying to be progressive, saying, let's use this to challenge ourselves. So from the very local and the very specific to the urban developers, and I think of these as the household managers of the future, right? The people who are building 21st century cities really are shaping the households that we live in, to companies. So I love it when I get that feedback that they're using it. And one of the reasons is because I've made this open source. Again, making it distributive. I made it open source so that anyone can pick it up and change it and use it. And that's the joy of seeing an idea be developed and changed and come back to you.
I'm really thankful for these new diagrams. I've always, at some point 30 years ago, I went to hear Jeffrey Sachs, who was, I think, working for the UN or the World Bank, and I thought, oh, this is a hero. And he measured everything by GDP. And I thought, how can that be? GDP, it doesn't matter if you've got 5 rich men and 5,000 million poor people. The GDP can be the same as that everybody gets the same. So I began to think of economics as really propaganda for major corporations and for the rich. So this is wonderful because it's something that you can really communicate a new way of thinking. It gives you a vocabulary for talking about economics that I think we haven't had before, or I haven't. So.
Thank you. Can I just add on this? So whenever you hear someone saying about the importance of GDP and GDP growth, 3 questions. 1, it's growing out of what? Like, what is causing it to grow? Is it because we're investing in solar capacity or because we're ripping up tar sands? 2, it's growing for whom? Is it growing for the 1%, your point, or is it growing for people who are living on low incomes who actually need it? And 3, if it's growing for good reasons, it must grow until when? If we're investing in solar capacity, until how much will be enough? If we're investing in public education, how many schools and how many teachers until we're enough? In nature, everything grows until it's enough. And so we need to ask that question. At what point is it enough?
Bob, there, yeah.
Yeah, just a comment. Having spent the early 70s at the LSE Cambridge, I demented.
I feel your pain.
I have a problem with this being romantic.
Great.
In that I'm of a belief anymore that capital seeks to displace labor with technology every place it can, if in so doing it can reduce the cost of goods sold, increase productivity, and give a higher return on capital. And we're doing a hell of a job. That is, we folks that do this are doing a hell of a job. And we have no idea what the rate is at which this is occurring, but we can all feel the pain of it. And the fact that there is no real analysis, and I would go to Marcuse and repressive tolerance in terms of the study that you're doing, and that's great, it's wonderful, it feels good, but man, the rate at which this displacement is occurring is now taking 7 billion people and diminishing their ability to ever get anything that is going to allow them to at least have the feed capital, if you will, to begin to help themselves in these models. I mean, the displacement of labor by technology is is the next thing that the economists react to. That's what's going on. And I don't know, I query you as to how one deals with that, given that that seems to be the answer of the growing elite, that is, in terms of the money they have.
So I'd say two things to that. The first one of the problems is that at the moment, the design of companies is to pursue labor productivity, right? To make, for every member of staff you employ, to make them generate as much return as possible. It is, of course, the wrong kind of productivity. What we should be chasing is resource productivity. And in an economy that was regenerative by design, we would be minimizing our use of resources so that we were no longer charging companies for hiring people with payroll taxes and subsidizing them for using machines with capital deductions, right? When you capital invest, you get some kind of depreciation capital deduction, which is topsy-turvy. It should be the other way around. We should be charging companies for using resources, and the whole automation story uses a heck of a lot of resources and energy. So they're massively going too far in that direction, not thinking about it being regenerative at all. And then bring people back where people's productivity in care, in creativity, in craft is incredibly valuable. So at the moment we have a tax system that is precisely promoting that automation but running us into a degenerative world, so that needs to flip. But secondly, yes, it looks like automation is reducing rapidly the number of jobs, and perhaps it even would carry on even if we flip those taxes. What I think that shows is that the relationship between the availability of work and the distribution of income is coming apart. It looked like in the 20th century that the availability of work and the requirements, a basic decent level of distribution of income, they seemed to be matched roughly. There was always some unemployment, always some problem about what wages people were paid, but roughly it seemed to be somehow adequate. That looks like it's coming apart, which I think kicks open a big question of how then do you ensure that everybody has sufficient income for engaging in the marketplace such that they can meet their essential needs and lead a life of dignity and opportunity and community. This is why we see so many people calling for one solution, a universal basic income, precisely because the role of the market for jobs has fallen away in providing that. So it's kicking open all sorts of new ideas for how to distribute income. I remember when I was working at Oxfam 10, 12 years ago, this idea of a basic income first came up. It seemed crazy. The idea, it was so radical. And yet now it's everywhere, which in a way gives hope that actually ideas do change. Again, 15 years ago, it was completely radical socialist to talk about inequality. You know, Branko Milanovic, who works at the World Bank, said it was socialist, weird to mention the word redistribution or inequality at the World Bank. Now even the head of the IMF is falling over herself to saying we have to have a shared economy, an inclusive growth. Nobody can mention the economy without saying it has to be inclusive and shared. Things change, at least in their rhetoric. We have to make it follow through. So yes, I think automation is really serious, but precisely we're taxing the wrong things. We're taxing jobs, not resources. And it kicks open that discussion of if not through the workplace we get decent income distribution, then how? And these radical ideas become incredibly practical.
I would suggest those battles that unemployment worldwide is going up much faster than any of the other good things. I won't see them happen. But the good things are like down here with a lot of pressure on them. Unemployment is being driven much faster.
Yep. And if that's a reinforcing feedback that sometimes something balances and something shifts, and whether that happens in a good way or a really bad way, and that's why we're here trying to promote the good ways, I guess. But yes, I agree with you. It is pelting towards a crisis of unemployment.
We'll just do one more.
Okay.
Maybe Nancy? Yeah. This is our last question, then we'll adjourn, but
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was a pleasure to see you develop your argument, to see the pictures, to see the use of the metaphor. And two comments. One is that here in the U.S., before this, we've had access to things like story stuff and Anne Leonard, which has been incredibly useful. I use it for my students as ways to try to bring these images out. But I'm very struck now hearing you and having looked at some of your materials on your recourse to discussing nature. And what concerns
That's a great point. Yes, the analogy from nature can be used in an incredibly dangerous way, this kind of social Darwinism, the idea that Darwin was for the survival of the fittest, and therefore those who are fittest should survive. Of course, I would say actually what Darwin meant was those who fit in best. And so fitting in best is a very different character from being the strongest. But yes, it can be deeply misused. I'm very inspired by the work of Janine Benyus, who is a biomimicry expert and thinker. And she works a lot about showing how, so we can find so many different patterns in nature, right? We can find horrible behavior in nature that we don't want at all to mimic in our societies. And in fact, of all the animals, all the mammals, we are the most social mammal by far. We out-socialize beyond even the naked mole rat. They are very, very sociable with their families, but when it comes to those beyond your immediate kin, we top the charts in terms of sociability. So we're not like nature in that sense, or rather we have a rather extraordinary nature that we should really harness. But I find the work of Janine Benyus very inspiring, talking about when you look at what brings stability and regeneration to the Earth system is these regenerative cycles. And that the economies we have constructed cut through that in this very linear way. So the pattern of nature that has inspired me is the idea of becoming back a part of a cycle. As she says, to come back home, bring ourselves back home to this home that is ours but not ours alone. And to think of everything that we do as how can we re-embed it within the living world, because the way we have industrialized has cut against that. And so the Anthropocene, the era of the planet where we are the driving force of planetary change, we are cutting against the living world. The Anthropocene won't go away because we are the dominant species on the planet. But how can we do that in such a way that we work with the cycles of life? So that's my immediate answer. But again, like the lady next to you, I really like the profundity of the question and the deep politics of the question. I'm not trying to close it and say, well, that's answered. These are really important questions. And somebody asked me the other day, so you're showing us all these old diagrams that have been misinterpreted and all the caveats have been lost. What about your diagrams, right? What are the caveats that mustn't be lost from yours? And I think what both of you are raising actually are the caveats that need to be carried with these diagrams, because every diagram can be misinterpreted and misused and told a false story. So there's always a responsibility with the words and the metaphors you choose and the pictures that you draw to steward them well. Thank you. Thank you very much.